away, but we won't do that. So my name is Joe Adebato. I'm the Director of Counseling. I see familiar faces here. Previously, this had been, for the last 2-3 years, this presentation was actually virtual. And fortunately, we are back to doing it live. Again, it is recorded by BCAT, but Amy's staff here has been coming here to the high school previous to that for a good 6 or 7 years at least, right? So she's spoken to Burlington families over the past several years about financial aid, and we know that it can be an anxiety-provoking process, but hopefully tonight you'll get some information that you'll find very helpful and useful to you. I did just want to quickly talk about the scholarship program. So Burlington works with several community members in town here through not just youth programs, but also some civic and fraternal organizations, businesses in town. So last year, about 180 students received probably around $380,000. So it was really, it really is amazing to see the generosity provided by people in town. Again, not just businesses, youth sport programs. There are families that have memorial scholarships. It's all on the high school counseling blog. We have a link to the scholarship program. And parents, if you want to have access to the scholarship applications, we can give you access to our college management program. It's called SCORE, and that's where we post the applications. Local scholarship applications will be available late February, right around March 1st. That's when you'll start to see all the local applications posted. Many of them are just simply online applications. Others are hard copies that you have to download and complete and bring to our office. So we will have a parent breakfast in March about the scholarship program, and then the counseling staff will be speaking with seniors about this as well. We do a presentation right here in this auditorium with seniors right around very early in March to remind them of the process and the steps that they need to take. Does anyone have any questions on the scholarship program? All right, well, I'll stick around. I'll be here after Amy finishes up too if you want to have any questions after. All right, well, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Amy Staff here.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to briefly give you a little bit of information about me so that you know that this is legitimate. So I have been working in financial aid for over 25 years. I worked at Harvard in undergraduate financial aid and admissions for 21 years, and then I've been at Simmons for over 4 years now. I'm currently the Assistant Vice President of Enrollment Student Services and Director of Financial Aid. And I have been volunteering on behalf of MIFA for about 22 years doing presentations at local high schools like this. I just believe that that's morally what I should do. This is what I do day in and day out, and I know that it can be stressful for families, even if they're going through it a second time or there's questions, because as you'll hear me say throughout the presentation, it depends. It can vary by institution, by year, and things like that. So, so that's kind of why I do what I do. And then MIFA is a not-for-profit state authority. I believe in what they do. They provide services like this to families. They provide a lot of support to counselors in Massachusetts and training. They also do have college savings programs, the 529 plan, as well as loans as well. So that's just a little bit about MIFA. So tonight we're going to go over the types and sources of financial aid. We'll look at the different applications that you may or may not need to fill out. So there's can be more than just the FAFSA that we all hear about. We will look at how financial decisions are made and kind of look at some sample financial aid packages, and then talk about actually paying that bill. I do like to walk around a little bit, so hopefully that's all right with people. And then we'll look at free resources that are available for help. So jumping right into, and if you have questions throughout the presentation, this is the beauty of in-person, which I can't do when we do it virtual, is taking questions as we go through, because sometimes you just might need a little bit of clarification. Feel free to raise your hand. I also will take questions at the end, and if there's something you don't want to ask in front of this large crowd, I will also stay at the end and answer any questions, turning the mic off. So what is financial aid? It can be broken out into 3 different categories. So first you have scholarship and grant aid. That is free money, does not need to be repaid. I'm going to skip work study for one moment and jump right to student loans. Student loans are funding that a student borrows and then repays at a later date. I'll talk more about loans when we get to a slide that provides those details. But both of those sources, if a student is borrowing loans and they're receiving grant or scholarship aid, go directly toward helping pay the bill that you'll receive for tuition and fees, and then room and board if a student is living on campus. So that's why I wanted to talk about those 2 together. Work study is another form of financial aid. Oftentimes it can be confusing. I get questions whether it's at this point or when I'm sitting with students who are trying to make decisions on college, or once they've decided where they're going, they're trying to figure out what exactly work study is. So it is a pot of money that comes from the federal government, and it is given to an institution. Not all institutions have a work study allocation, and for those that do have a work study allocation, not all have the same amount. Here in Massachusetts, where, and probably the Northeast, we're lucky because we have so many older institutions, and so we have something called a base guarantee. So we get an allotment of money, and then we might get more on top of that from kind of a general allocation. Those dollars an institution uses to pay up to 75% usually of a student's wages in an on-campus job. There are also some off-campus opportunities dependent on the institution. And for some institutions, that's the only way that they're able to afford, having students work on campus. So it is, you'll see an amount listed on an award letter, and that's kind of the ceiling of earnings that that student can earn in a work-study job. As I mentioned in the beginning, you'll hear me in answering questions or as I talk about different concepts saying it depends, because every school is different. And with work-study, I just want to point out that it might be that you are offered, or the student is offered work study at one institution and isn't offered at another, and that just might be that they don't have the funding, or they don't have enough to stretch across all students, and they kind of draw a line in the sand of who they might be offering that to. You can always ask an institution if they have that, if the student wanted it. And also, if a student is offered work study, they don't have to accept it. It doesn't affect their other financial aid. So it's not as if that you answer on the FAFSA that I'm interested in work study, you're not going to get less in scholarship or grant aid because of receiving that work study. This slide just kind of looks at where the funding is coming from. I did have coffee over the summer with a family whose child was starting their oldest child, starting their first year in college this fall, and they had just wanted to ask a couple of questions about loans and kind of paying the bill. And they remarked that when they had gone through and sat through a presentation like this, and then went through the process of receiving financial aid packages from institutions, they didn't realize how little the federal government actually has in financial aid. They have the Pell Grant, and currently about 90% of the students who are receiving a Pell Grant come from families with income of $50,000 or less. I like to just provide that data point because I feel like oftentimes you hear information about, Pell Grant or other things, and there's no kind of further information along with that. In the 24-25 academic year, so if your child is a senior right now, their first year will be 23-24. In the 24-25 year, there are significant changes that are happening to the federal form, and I will kind of reference those as we go through the presentation. These are, and again, I've been doing this for over 25 years, the largest changes that have ever happened to the federal awarding of financial aid. And one of the benefits is that more students will actually be eligible for the Pell Grant, which is a wonderful thing. So perhaps that figure that I provided of the 90% at 50,000, that should increase the income threshold. Work study comes through the federal government. Student loans also through the federal government. MIFA puts in here tax incentives. I don't always think of that as financial aid, but the dollars you pay toward tuition, up to $2,000 can be a tax credit in the following year. So, some sort of benefit. I still don't think about it as financial aid, but we put that on the slide. In the state of Massachusetts, if the student's a Massachusetts resident and then attending a Massachusetts school, if they're eligible for a Pell Grant, they're typically going to be eligible for the one grant, the Massachusetts State Grant. It's very similar and to the Pell Grant. The federal Pell Grant this year is about $6,800 is the maximum that a student could receive, and that would be at like a private institution. It's based on a figure that is the expected family contribution, which comes from the FAFSA form, filling that out, and I'll talk about that, and then the cost of the institution. So a student who might have a 0 parent contribution at a highest level institution would be eligible for that $6,800. If they went to, say, a community college, it would be a lesser amount that they're eligible for because there's a grid. And the Massachusetts, very similar, but in Massachusetts, the highest Massachusetts state grant is about $2,800 for the year. Massachusetts also has some scholarships and tuition waivers. The note here with loans in Massachusetts, and the same goes for colleges and universities, don't necessarily expect to see that at an institution. The state has a no-interest loan program, Massachusetts no-interest loan program, which sounds wonderful, right? And it is, but just to give you an example, when I was at Harvard, we had a $30,000 allocation that we could use for Massachusetts residents. At Simmons, we don't actually have an allocation. I've been trying to get one, but they just don't have the funding. And so I just kind of also like to provide that background or surround that, it might be an option, but I wouldn't be expecting it. And then when we look at institutions, I would say most institutions don't have loan programs. If they do, it might be more of kind of emergency situations. We have one at Simmons, which I use, very rarely in more kind of emergency situations and at small amounts because we just don't have a lot of funding available. And then other agencies, you've already heard about local scholarships, and typically we'll talk about that in this presentation because in my experience, that's where I see the most dollars coming in from students. But there are also national kind of scholarships that students can apply for. So you'll see here a couple of options to search for scholarships. MIFA has MIFA Pathway. There's also fastweb.com. The College Board has something called Big Future, and they actually do like a lottery for these $40,000 scholarships that they're giving away like every month or something. And so the question becomes, is it worth the work because it is work to say, with any of these search engines, the student has to fill out a profile about themselves. Then it will get run through and it will search and see, does this student meet the criteria for any of the scholarships, thousands of scholarships in the database. And so any that they meet that criteria, that they would be eligible, they're going to email the student the information about these scholarships. What I have heard as feedback from students is it could be overwhelming because they get a lot of emails. If the criteria is pretty basic, right? Live in Massachusetts, or live in a certain area in Massachusetts, they're going to get a lot, and so it's just weeding through and then doing the work of actually applying. So it would be an application, probably an essay, and some other information. I am going to reserve answering, is it worth the work, until we look at some sample financial aid packages, because that's the best place. I'm a visual person, and I feel like that's the best place to answer that question and kind of show how it can be worth the work. Excuse me. MIFA has put this slide right in the beginning of the presentation. It never was before, and I happened to say at a meeting, because I think I had done one of the first presentations back in early September, why is this slide here? I haven't talked about certain concepts yet, like financial aid eligibility and how that's determined, which is how I like to describe subsidized and unsubsidized and give you a better sense of the eligibility for those two different loans. But people at MIFA said, well, we already get questions early on about loans, and so we kind of put it up here. One thing that I do like to point out, because you likely have heard about the Biden-Harris debt relief, that the application just opened for that, for folks who currently have loan debt. I was at a meeting where the director of financial aid at Bunker Hill Community College was also at, and we were having a discussion, and she said, this was just about a month ago, she said, are any of you seeing increased borrowing this year from students? And most of us were at private institutions, and we said, no, we hadn't really noticed that. But she was noticing, and where the cost is lower, sometimes the students really aren't utilizing those federal loans, but she saw an uptick and then reached out and was speaking with some of the students, and they assumed that it was going to be forgiven. But that Biden-Harris forgiveness is for loans that were dispersed prior to July 1st, 2022. So I do just like to put that information out there so that people know we have no idea what might happen in the future. And so there's no guarantee that this might happen again for that loan forgiveness. So with the federal direct student loans, the student is the sole borrower. So as long as they've completed a FAFSA form, which is the application applying for financial aid, and as long as they are a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, they're eligible to borrow through the federal direct loan program. You'll notice here that there are limits on what you can borrow. So a first-year student can only borrow $5,500 in direct loans. And that goes up to $6,500 sophomore year, and junior and senior, they could borrow up to $7,500. So when you hear stories about, kind of crushing loan debt and that being detrimental to, a student trying to move on in their life, it's not from these loans and these limits. If a student borrowed that total amount, it's the maximum each year. It's $27,000, which is about a $300 or just under $300 payment, depending on the interest rate when a student takes on those loans. So it's when a student borrows additional funding trying to meet a gap, and we'll look at that, or students who go on to graduate school. Typically, there's less in scholarship grant aid that's available. I work with both graduate and undergraduate students. Sometimes I see students borrowing for living expenses and borrowing kind of a significant amount. I try to always coach these students to make sure they're borrowing, you know, the least amount as possible, but it's those levels that start to tip the scales, and that I 100% caution students and families about understanding what the commitment is and what they're borrowing. So looking at things like, what does it really mean to take on, say, this loan or this level? And when you look at that it's a $300 monthly payment, and if you look at the average starting salary, then you can see like that would be reasonable, typically. It's when you start to add additional debt on top of that that you really need to be careful in what you're taking on. This subsidized and unsubsidized. For each of these limits, with the first-year student, up to $3,500 can be subsidized, and then there's an additional $2,000 that can be unsubsidized. That is unsubsidized. Sophomore year, it's $4,500 subsidized, and I'll explain what that means. And then here, it's up to $5,500 can be subsidized. I haven't yet talked about the formula, but basically, you take the cost of attendance of an institution, subtract out output from the FAFSA form, the expected family contribution. As long as there is a positive number there, that means that there's financial aid eligibility or need, and so the student would be eligible for that subsidized version, meaning that the interest is being paid by the government, it's being subsidized the entire time that the student is enrolled in school, and will continue to be subsidized until they enter into repayment, which is typically 6 months after they graduate. I only say typically because if a student withdraws from school for longer than 6 months, those loans will start to accrue interest and they'll go into repayment, meaning they have to make a monthly payment on them. Unsubsidized is that the interest is accruing from the time the loan is dispersed, and that interest can be paid quarterly or it can be capitalized, which means you're adding it onto the loan, and then it sits until the student goes into repayment on the loan. It used to be that the 35, 45, and 55 figures that I told you, those were the annual limits. And I don't know how many years ago now, most things in my career, I feel like, oh, it's just a few years ago. It was probably like 15, 20 years ago. Families saying, oh, the rising cost of education, can you increase the limits? And the federal government said, we can increase the limits by $2,000, but it has to be unsubsidized, no matter if you qualify for a subsidized loan. If there is no need or financial aid eligibility, a student can still borrow these limits and it would be fully unsubsidized. And it's always the student or family's choice how much they might want to borrow. It will be clearly listed in any financial aid letter that you get. One line would say subsidized if you're receiving subsidized, one would say unsubsidized. It's never going to be just one amount unless it's the fully unsubsidized. So the next two slides go into how aid is awarded. So the first slide, we look at basing it on merit. So there's some reason that the student is being awarded. Typically, a scholarship. When I first talked about scholarship and grant aid, and both of those are aid that does not need to be repaid, typically, the word scholarship relates to aid that is based on merit, and typically that word grant is what we'll next talk about is when it's based on need or kind of financial information of the family. So awarded in recognition of a student's achievement, so it might be academic, it might be athletic, it might be the student, is this fantastic tuba player and the institution needs that. There's some reason that the money is given to the student, and likely, if it's renewable, the student might have to do something in order to keep that. So if it's an academic scholarship, it might be a certain GPA needs to be met at the end of the year in order to keep that in the following year. You want to make sure that kind of reading through, typically these would be awarded through the admission process rather than on the financial aid side. I often joke with my admission colleagues and say, could you make the font any smaller? Because they like to keep it on one page, the admission letter, right? Which is great, except when you start to add in more information on there, it gets really small. So just read through that, because everything will be listed there, what the amount is, whether or not it's renewable, and then if there's anything that the student needs to do in order to keep that. I'm going to throw in another kind of story from the work that I do. I have seen, and I'm sure if you haven't seen it with your own eyes, you've heard of an increase in mental health issues among our young people, anxiety, depression. With our scholarships at my institution, the requirement for a merit scholarship is a GPA and continuous enrollment. And so I have seen an uptick and had created a merit scholarship reinstatement form, knowing that there might be circumstances somewhat out of a student's control, right? Maybe they're having a mental health crisis and they need to take a semester off and then come back. I wanted to ensure that there's a process in place that we could possibly do that. So we have an appeal process. I'm not saying that every institution has opportunities like that, but I just like to encourage people to ask, right? If something gets lost, to be able to ask, is there a way to gain that back? Because the worst they will say is no, and the best they say is, yep, here's a process, and we've reinstated that for you. So the other thing I like to point out is that fourth bullet point about a separate application sometimes is required, and to check the deadline. So 100% ensure that your child or yourself or both of you are looking at the websites or the materials that come. I should say that I have a daughter who is a first-year college student this year, and then I have a junior, so I am doing the same thing that you guys are going through. It was interesting to go through that process and see just the boatloads of materials that come in through the mail, that I was recycling so many of them. But important to look through that information or just look on the website, because for instance, at my institution, we will assess without an application for merit scholarships, and many institutions will do that who have merit scholarships, just in the general pool of through the admission process. But we have a couple of scholarships that you have to apply for. For instance, we have one scholarship that has a December 1st deadline. It requires a separate application, an essay, actually 2 essays, but it's full tuition, room and board, and then a stipend of $3,000 each year. Right? And I remember meeting with a student when I first arrived at Simmons who was a sophomore, and she was kind of struggling, and she said, is there any way I could apply for that? I never knew about it when I was applying here, and unfortunately my hands are tied because it's through the admission process. It's only to students applying out of high school for that scholarship. So that's another thing to note, is to make sure you know what is available at each and every school, or task your child with looking at those things. So the other way, and probably a good majority of financial aid is awarded based on need. So that's looking at income and asset information of the student and parent. The second bullet point here, eligibility determined by a standardized formula. I just like to point out that with any sort of federal aid, there is this standard formula calculated from the FAFSA form. Some institutions may use a slightly different formula. It's very similar, and it's in a school that uses the CSS Profile form, and I'll talk about that. I have been at schools that use both and have used both formulas. I always like to say that when I've worked with the CSS Profile and that formula for calculating the expected family contribution, oftentimes it was more generous. So I think if you start to say colleges who award their own dollars might use a separate formula, it might sound like, oh, they're probably making it less generous, but it was not. And you will see that the profile form, if you have to fill that form out, actually asks for a lot more information. So it includes any sort of grants, loans, work study, any sort of federal aid, any sort of state aid, state need-based aid, so that Massachusetts State Scholarship would be based on need. And then this last bullet point, that a student must be making satisfactory academic progress. The federal government tasks financial aid with a lot of rules and regulations, which is very fun, and we get audited every year, which is also very fun. And one of the things that we're required to ensure is that students are making this satisfactory academic progress, and the federal government defines that as that they are at least at a 2.0 GPA by the end of sophomore year, and that they are moving through school at a certain pace, and it's 67%. And what that means is that the number of attempted credits versus like completed credits is at least 67%. They just want to ensure that basically if students are borrowing funds, right, that they're actually moving forward and progressing to be able to graduate in at least 6 years. So that's what that's about. I have had situations, particularly during the pandemic, where I had a first-year student who the online learning environment really didn't work for them, and so they had attempted some credits and withdrew, and they were automatically, they could never be at that 67%, which then they lose their financial aid eligibility. Every institution, the government has this option of having an appeal process, and basically every institution has that. So again, just noting that let's say something happens and a student loses their financial aid eligibility, there always is an option to appeal that. Usually the student has to put their kind of unusual circumstances in writing. They might have to work with an advisor, which is a good thing, right? Someone who's going to help them along with an academic plan to get them back on track. So just know that as well. Any questions about what I talked about so far before I move on to the applications? Okay. So check deadlines. Critically important. Know what the deadlines are at each institution, and it could vary. I personally would, and I'm a paper person, only because I really like to check off on a piece of paper. It's just not the same when you make a checklist on Excel and just like kind of, you know, cross it out or whatever electronically. I like to physically check that off. But, you know, putting the institution, what forms are required, and what their deadline is. Some institutions are going to hold hard and fast to those deadlines, and because they may have a limited pot of their own institutional dollars, and a lot of funding does come from an institution itself. And so I always like to stress meeting deadlines for an institution. It doesn't mean that if you miss the deadline and get it in later, that you're not going to receive aid at an institution. Because many institutions, and the two that I've worked at, will accept it past a deadline, and that's fine. But I have been in situations and meetings where, you know, an institution has said, oh no, like that we have to use that because we have only so much money, and we use that kind of to cut off. Or perhaps they might receive less in aid if they miss the deadline. So I like to highlight that. It doesn't always align with, say, the admission deadline. So let's say a student was applying early The financial aid deadline might still be later, right? So if the early deadline is November 15th, the institution still may say, you know what, get your financial aid information in by, February 1st. Every institution is different. So the FAFSA is the form that if you're applying for financial aid, everyone is going to have to fill this form out. FAFSA stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid. You shouldn't have to pay anyone to complete this. There actually used to be a website, FAFSA.com, that would charge people $50 or $75 to complete the free form. The government actually bought that site out finally, and so that does not exist. It is required by all colleges, becomes available as of October 1st. The student, and in a two-parent household, one parent needs each their own FSA ID, so FSA, Federal Student Aid ID, and that becomes your electronic signature for completing the FAFSA. It also, if you're going to borrow, if the student borrows a federal loan or the parent borrows a federal loan, you're using that FSA ID to apply and to sign for those loans. The FSA ID, they will ask for you to create a username and password, but it's also looking at social security number, date of birth, so it's related to your information. The IRS data retrieval tool is when you're completing the FAFSA, you'll get to a section where it's asking about tax information, right? Things like AGI and taxes paid, certain untaxed income. And you have the option to actually go over to the IRS site using your FSA ID, because again, it's very much related to you as a person with your date of birth, your name, and your social security number. And it pulls those data elements in and fills that into the FAFSA for you. There is an Understanding the FAFSA webinar. If you are interested, on the MIFA website, and it goes line by line right through the FAFSA form. I will also talk about some other free resources if you haven't yet completed it and you wanted to, even if it was just ask a quick question, there's some great resources for completing the FAFSA. It does have to be completed every year. So the information that gets reported on the FAFSA, it's going to start with asking information about the student, kind of demographic information. I can't stress enough to make sure that the social security number, particularly for the student, because I feel like, I know for myself, it was like, oh my God, I gotta go find the card. I know my own well enough, but my child's. And that social security number gets associated with the application. In fact, there's this little identifier that's the social security number and the first two letters of the last name. If you get that social security number, if you input it wrong, that wrong number gets associated at the top level, and that's how institutions load data into our system. So typically we have to say, even if you went in and updated the social security number, it doesn't update that top number, that stays the same. So usually if you kind of mess that up, we have to complete a new FAFSA form. I had an incident when I was at Harvard that I had this set of twins that were accepted and came to the institution, and they had commingled their social security numbers, and it literally took me months to try and get that fixed on the federal side. So really important to make sure that is correct. As I said, a student has to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. If a parent doesn't have to be, but they're not able to get an FSA ID, and because you need a social security number to do that. And so they would just put all zeros in the social security section on the FAFSA, and then they also would have to, there's an option to print and then mail the signature page. You're going to put the colleges where the student is applying, and you can put up to 10 colleges on the FAFSA, and that information will get sent electronically. Typically, it takes 48 hours, right, for an institution to get that information. But we usually say, just to be on the safe side, if you are going to make any changes, wait 3 to 5 days for those institutions to get it. If the student is applying to more than 10 schools, you wait those 3 to 5 days, you can go back into the FAFSA, you can remove a school, and then you can add the new school on, and that institution then electronically will get that information. If that's the scenario, just make sure at the end of the day, whatever institution that your child has decided they're attending that school, make sure they're still the one listed, that they are still listed on the FAFSA. Some people will say, well, how do I prioritize? I would just go by deadlines. Make sure the ones that maybe have an earliest deadline get on there first. Parents. So this is one that oftentimes can be frustrating to hear, but the student information, then we move into the parent information, and what parents, and you know, we can have different situations, living arrangements, but if parents are married, including same-sex parents, and they are living together, married or not, both parent information is on the FAFSA. So a married family and they're, you know, living together, or if they are the biological or adoptive parents and they've never been married but they are living in the same household, both parents' information is required to be on the FAFSA form. In the case of divorced or separated parents, if they are living together, and I have seen that scenario many times, if they are living together, both parents' information is to be on the FAFSA form. If they are living separate, it's the custodial parent's information that is reported on the FAFSA and not that other parent's information. So who is the custodial parent? The Department of Education says that whomever the child resides with more, it's that parent's information. If that parent is remarried, it's their spouse's information as well. And I know I oftentimes, actually recently had someone yell at me about that, and it's not my decision, it's the government. I am just providing the message. In the case where I've had people say, what if it's 50-50, that the child lives 50-50 at the parent's home, then the second line of defense is who provides more financial support for the child. Then it's that parent whose information should be on the FAFSA, and if they are remarried, their spouse's information. I do want to point out when I talked about the changes that are coming in the 24-25 year, so if your child is a senior in high school this year, this would be their sophomore year in college. With the changes that are happening, they are changing who the custodial parent is, and it will be determined by who provides more support, and that's who should be listed on the FAFSA. In the case of any legal guardians, for instance, I actually was doing a presentation in Westford a couple of weeks ago, and a grandparent came up and said, you know, my grandson lives with us, you know, I'm not going to get into, it was a pretty bad situation, the parent side, you know, and then they asked, and then they said, and we adopted him recently. I said, well, then you do actually need to be on the FAFSA, but if they hadn't adopted him, and they were, say, a legal guardian, their information would not be on the FAFSA. There's a set of questions that determine a student's dependency status. If they're considered dependent, which most high school students are, then their parents' information has to be on there. To be considered independent and not have parent information reported, the student has to be either 24 or older, married, in graduate school, a veteran or active duty, a ward of the court, had been in foster care, or an orphan. Those are kind of the typical examples. There are scenarios that a student could possibly be deemed independent. It would have to be documented with third-party documentation, typically unusual. I've seen cases of kind of abuse, neglect, things like that that are unusual, that the student then kind of has to work with each institution to put forward what's called a dependency override. The last bit of information here is the number in household and the number of children in college. So included in the household would be anyone who's living in the household, and that the kind of parents are providing more than half of their support. So in an instance of, let's say, maybe a grandparent might be living in the household, you can include them as part of the household if you're paying more than half of their support and will continue to, that's how it's written on the FAFSA, in that upcoming academic year that the student will be in school. And then for number of children in college, if a parent is in college, you can't include them as the number in college, it's children. So dependent children who would be in college. That is another item that is changing that a lot of people are kind of up in arms about. So when you complete the FAFSA, the output, and I've mentioned this, is the expected family contribution. So it's this kind of measure of, the government defines this more as the figure that a family can absorb of 1 year of college costs. Well, in the scenario of 2 in college, that expected family contribution then gets cut in half, so 1 for each child. But if it was in 1 child in college household, that full amount goes to that child. In the 24-25 year, that is changing, and it will no longer come into play. It will it will still ask about it, but it will no longer affect the expected family contribution. In fact, it's going to be called something new, called a SAI, which is a student aid index figure. But again, there are a lot of other changes that are happening where I sat December 27th, 2020 is when this law first came out, and it was supposed to be in effect for the 23-24 year. As I've said, there's so much that is changing, and they pushed it out another year because they still have a lot of work to do. But I sat down and kind of did hand calculations of some of my students to see how would it change. And I saw, really the number in college is the only one where you saw a change that was more significant in a worse way. But for most students, I was seeing an increase in their financial aid eligibility. Okay. The financial information, I've briefly touched on this. If your student is a senior in high school, for that first year, it's going to be asking about 2021 income information. That's what you're to report on the FAFSA form. Both taxed and untaxed income. So the taxed income is going to come right off of the tax return. Most of the untaxed income will as well. Typically, the one bit of untaxed income that you'll have to kind of report yourself is if you put money into a retirement vehicle, 401k, 403b, or any other self-employed SEP, KEO, something like that, you have to report that as untaxed income. On the asset side, you do not include the value of the retirement account, but on the income side, you have to report an amount that you put in out of your income. Parent and student assets, so you're going to include savings, checking, investment, other property, right? So your home, your primary home residence is not included, but if you own other property, that would and is required to be included. If you have a 529 account, that's another one where people kind of don't understand. If you have multiple children and you have a 529 college savings account for multiple children, you're to report all of them on the FAFSA. And you'll note there it says reported as a parent asset. The student is a beneficiary on those 529 accounts, and the parent is the owner. But that actually is a good thing because parent assets are assessed at about 5% going into the expected family contribution, where students' assets are 20%. Yeah. For including? Yeah. So what you do not include is the net value of your primary home residence. You don't include value of retirement, life insurance, or a small family business or farm. Yeah, on the income side, the retirement. Right, exactly, yep. On the asset side, you do not report the value. On the income side, you're just putting in, if you put out of your income, you put money into a retirement account in the year, that gets included as untaxed income. But on the asset side, it doesn't ask about at all retirement, so you don't report it.
You set it aside.
Yeah.
So if you have a mixed 401k where you do partly tax and partly untaxed, then you just put the untaxed portion of that. If you have a Roth.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yep. Yep. If a grandparent happens to own the 529 account and the student is the beneficiary, you're obviously not reporting it on the form. And there's no place that you're reporting any sort of debt that you have. In the formula to kind of calculate the expected family contribution, there's general allowances against income, federal tax, state tax. It'll ask on the form about your each parent earnings, and that's because it calculates FICA and reduces that from income. The number in household and number in college produces an income protection allowance. So based on that makeup, there's a figure and that reduces from income, and that's kind of covering maintenance of the home. So it's not as if it's just taking all the income and there isn't stuff, but there's no reporting of other debts, right?
Go back on that retirement thing, because in the W-2 is already in there, so when they pull in my tax return, would I still?
Yeah, it doesn't because it's not on the actual tax return. So typically on your W-2, it would be listed in box 12, right? So it's been excluded out of that box 1 where your earnings are, right? And that's what's going on to generate the AGI on the tax return, so that this amount. And I will note, when you're completing the FAFSA, for every single question, there is a question mark in a circle that you can click on, and it expands and it tells you exactly where, how to answer a question, or for a question like that, exactly where to find that information on like a W-2 form or on a tax return, which is very helpful. So the CSS Profile form has a few differences. Just to kind of set the stage on if you need to complete this form. There's about 240 institutions across the United States that require student families to complete the CSS Profile form. I'm not gonna lie, the profile form takes a lot more time to complete. Can be a little bit more challenging because it asks for a whole lot more information. Some institutions may only ask for it in the first year, and they kind of get a baseline, and then in following years, they're just collecting the FAFSA. If an institution is collecting the profile, they're also collecting the FAFSA no matter what, because they have to award any sort of federal aid. There is a cost involved, so $25 for the first school and $16 for each additional. There are fee waivers available. Similar, this is through the College Board, so similar to like SAT fee waivers. And there's a set of questions as the student goes in to begin to complete the profile, and they'll assess if they are eligible for the fee waiver. It also became available October 1st. One of the other big differences is that in a divorced or separated parent situation, the profile is filled out by the custodial parent, but the non-custodial parent would have to fill out the non-custodial profile. It gets sent to that non-custodial parent. That information never kind of connects for the student or custodial parent to see, or non-custodial parent to see any of that financial data. There is a what to know about the CSS Profile webinar that walks through the profile. That's also on the MIFA website if you're interested. If you have to complete that form, that's there. Yeah. College Board.
It's the College Board with the SAT.
Like the SAT, yep, yeah. And typically it's, you know, an institution that might have more significant funding to award. Again, it collects more information. So where I currently am, we just collect the FAFSA. Where I was before, we collected FAFSA, profile, tax returns for all families. If you have a business tax return, all of that information. So again, every school is different. So having that list of the schools, what's required, and what those deadlines are is helpful. College financial aid application. It's getting pretty rare that a college has their own financial aid application that they might ask a family to fill out. I know that when I got to Simmons 4 years ago, they had their own application. I've since gotten rid of it because it really wasn't providing anything and it was a barrier. But again, to the point of looking on the website of each institution and knowing what they require. It could be that the institution has you know, some endowed funds, some donor funds, and they want to gather some particular information that would never come off of the profile or the FAFSA form, and maybe that's why they're requiring a separate application. Most institutions don't have it, but just to be aware that it's a possibility. So after applying, colleges and the state, so the state, just by the student answering that they are a Massachusetts resident on the FAFSA form, the state actually electronically gets information to assess are they eligible for the Massachusetts state grant. And colleges get the information. Students will receive a student aid report, and the parent, if they've put their email address on the form, should receive the same. It is a detailed listing of everything that you put on the FAFSA form, the student aid report. The profile has a similar report that gets generated. But on the FAFSA student aid report, you're also going to get details like what the expected family contribution is, whether or not a student has been selected for verification, and I'll talk about what that means, and then any other items that might require follow-up. Probably the most common that I see with students is verifying citizenship status. I don't know why I always have trouble saying that word. And so it's then up to the institution to just collect documentation to verify that. Federal verification. The government, through the Department of Education, randomly selects FAFSAs to be verified, and they put that requirement on the institution. So we have to reach out to students, and there are certain data elements that we need to verify, and that would be certain income, AGI, taxes paid, and some untaxed income, and then number in family and number in college. If you have used the data retrieval tool, that financial information has already been verified, and so all we would need to do is collect what's called a verification worksheet and verify that household information. Every institution is different. Some may want to collect that verification up front before they provide a financial aid package. At my institution, for incoming students, because typically I don't see huge changes when we're verifying information, but We'll provide an estimated award based on what you filed, and then we'll collect the documentation after so that we can get information out sooner. So every school is a little bit different. And then colleges will review and determine the financial aid award and then send that out. And again, every institution is a little different on how they might do that. So again, to the different stages where people apply, so students might apply early. They might get information, let's say, about a merit scholarship through the admission process, but they don't yet receive financial aid information until a little bit later in February, say, or January. Or an institution could be like mine, where I made a change where I say, I encourage students, if you can get your FAFSA to us by the deadline that you're applying, right? So we have an EA1 November 1st, EA2 December 1st, and then regular February 1st, then we will provide your financial aid along with getting your acceptance. Because in my book, I want to provide that full information so that you have it all at the same time. I already talked about verification, so we'll move on to, this is just some questions, you know, asking that you can ask the financial aid office, what does aid look like in year 2, right? Hopefully an institution who's awarding need-based aid will say, if income stays about the same, you know, you should see a similar financial aid award in the following year. Asking about how private scholarships might affect financial aid. I'll delve into that a little more, along with answering the question of if it's worth the work in the next couple of slides when we look at sample financial aid awards. The how will 24-25 FAFSA changes affect my financial aid? Likely most institutions won't fully have that answered. I know a lot of us are kind of looking at that as we're going through this process, because there still hasn't been a ton of information that's come out of the government. Personally, I think they've been so busy doing all of the Biden debt, Harris debt forgiveness stuff and getting that application and focused on that, that I'm not sure how much work is going on. I'm hoping it gets pushed off another year, but we'll see. But still something to ask about, because likely you're not going to be receiving information for a bit. And so there's time, and then you don't have to make a decision right until May 1st. Special considerations. So you heard me say, and this is for both the FAFSA and the profile, that 2021 income information has to be listed on the form. There's no going around that. But obviously, you know, as we are deep into 22, circumstances can change. It could be job loss, some sort of medical, you know, situation has happened, and things look quite different now. You have to complete with the 2021 income information, but you can ask the institution, what is your appeal process? I have special circumstances that are unusual, and can I apply for additional aid? Most institutions will have some sort of appeal process in place. I know there are some institutions that don't do any sort of appeals. So you do have to ask. Every single one is going to require you to have something in writing about what the circumstance is, and then provide documentation. Typically, they'll walk you through what is required for documentation. It might be an online form. So that's something that if you know that your situation is something that doesn't quite fit into that FAFSA box, you could now start writing out that kind of narrative. We're audited every year. There's specific requirements that we're bound by if we make adjustments using what's called professional judgment to change certain data elements. We have to have documentation of why we made those changes. I've already really kind of talked about the 24-25 FAFSA changes, so we're going to go right into looking at some sample financial aid packages. Are there any lingering questions on what I've talked about before we jump into looking at those samples? So these are the slides where I wish I had them before talking about the student loan stuff. But this is the start of the basic financial aid formula, which I already said was cost of attendance minus expected family contribution. So the cost of attendance is made up of billed or direct expenses, so tuition fees, room and board if living on campus. So these are figures that you're actually going to receive the bill for. And then it also includes non-billed or indirect expenses, and these are estimates for books and supplies, transportation, personal expenses. Gives you a sense of, oh yeah, there's more than just those billed expenses for going into that first year, or any year really. The expected family contribution, as I already noted, the federal government looks at it as kind of the amount a family has the ability to absorb 1 year of college costs, rather than thinking, oh, when you see that expected family contribution, yeah, I can just take that right out and put it down. Thinking of it more as absorbing that year of college cost. Same federal formula used, but some colleges might use an institutional EFC formula. So, for instance, at a school that's using that profile, you might see the expected family contribution on the FAFSA, and you might see something different listed on an award letter from the institution that might be using a different formula for awarding their own institutional funds. The idea with financial aid is the family has the primary responsibility for paying, and financial aid is there to help supplement and fill a gap. The EFC is not necessarily what the family will pay. Lowered currently if family has more than one child in college. So when you subtract the expected family contribution from the cost of attendance, you get a figure that is a student's financial aid eligibility. This is also sometimes referred to as need. One thing I want to point out is with the cost of attendance, I was mentioning that, including these figures in the cost of attendance provides families and students an idea of what that 1 year costs, right? It's more than just the billed expenses. Note that these are estimates, and a student likely is not necessarily paying those exact amounts out. But the other benefit of, that institutions include these, and the government has us include this information, it's also increasing the student's financial aid eligibility, right? Because we're having higher cost of attendance than just what the billed costs are. I'll also say that, actually I'll save this for the next slide when we look at a sample award, but I will note just a piece of advice. My own daughter, as I said, is a first year in college, and she called me recently and said, oh, she's like, Aiden, who was her boyfriend, found all of her books online resources, and she didn't have to pay anything. And she was kind of excited, but almost felt nervous about it, but it was all legitimate, stuff. So I don't know if anyone remembers being in school and purchasing really expensive textbooks and barely getting any money back at the end of the semester for those. So there are a lot of resources out there and so just encourage your children to kind of look into those resources. All right, so this is the first kind of look at a financial aid package. You're never going to have an interactive package that comes from an institution where all of a sudden we throw in the expected family contribution, but it kind of works to look at it in this way. The cost of attendance for this school is $45,000. The expected family contribution I threw up there is $5,000. So if you were paying attention, their financial aid eligibility is $40,000, right? So this student has been offered grant and scholarship aid that equals about $27,500. They've been offered the maximum federal student loan that a student can borrow, the $5,500 figure. They've been given a ceiling of work study of $2,000. And this is where I just want to point out, because oftentimes when students and parents are at the point of, okay, I'm making a decision on an institution, I'm looking at this financial aid package, and it has the cost of attendance and it has these figures, that work study is not something that's going to go toward those bills expenses, right? But how it relates is typically the students using their earnings to pay for things like personal expenses or books. And so that's kind of how it ends up relating. But just remember that when you're looking at kind of even comparing and looking at what will be my out-of-pocket cost to the bill. Don't be including that work study because it's not going to get credited right to the bill. So if you have done the quick math here, you'll realize that these items don't equal $40,000. So now there is unmet need to reach the cost of attendance of $5,000. It doesn't necessarily mean that 5 plus this 5, $10,000 is what you're paying out, right? Because there is a portion of the cost of attendance that are estimates for these kind of indirect costs. And this is where I want to just circle back to that beginning conversation about scholarships and how it can be worth the work. So let's say a student kind of really has their heart set on one particular institution. That's where they want to go. And there's unmet need, or there's less aid available at that school than another school, perhaps, on their acceptance list. If they have done the work and kind of secured some outside scholarship funding, typically a school is going to have that go towards unmet need first. Back 25, 26 years ago, when I was first in aid, sometimes, I remember actually at Harvard at the time, it was like a 60-40 split it was going against, because we didn't have unmet need, but it would go toward reducing loans, but also scholarship. There's been a ton of work done by organizations and having institutions sign off to say, yeah, it's going to go toward reducing unmet need first. If a student receives scholarships that kind of exceed that, then reduce any work study or student loans before ever reducing scholarship or grant aid. The federal government, has said a student can't be receiving subsidized aid or need-based aid that exceeds their financial aid eligibility, and you can't receive total aid, including loans, above the cost of attendance. So that's why adjustments have to be made. Net price calculators. If you have not used a net price calculator, it's a good tool when doing research about a school prior to ever getting a financial aid award. It allows you to input information, right? Income information, so 2021 income information. If the institution has kind of put criteria in there to assess and provide information about merit scholarships, it might ask about GPA of the student. And then it's going to give you a sense of someone who might look like your child academically and your family financially, and what that student kind of received for aid or paid, who is a current first-year student, right? So it helps give you a sense of what might we expect to see. It's the idea also that, not ruling out a school just because the cost is high. Know what sort of funding they have available before you're saying, you know what, this one's going to be too much. Because again, it can vary, and institutions might have funding that makes that net cost a lot less than what that kind of sticker price is that you see. So these next two slides are looking at a comparison of some financial aid packages. You're likely not going to see the exact same cost of attendance at each institution, but just for the sake of the example, it makes it easier. So here, we have college aid that meets full need. That's a term that we use where there's no unmet need. And it's, there's a significantly more in grant and scholarship aid provided. College B, has some unmet need here, and maybe this is a student who might have missed the deadline and is getting a little bit less in aid, or just an institution that just doesn't have enough funding to kind of spread it across every single student and meet every single student's need, and most institutions don't have that ability. And then College C here. So really just a variety that you may see of financial aid packages, and also, again, not ruling out a school just because of cost, because they might have, more aid available for the student that makes it more reasonable to be able to afford. In this example, I'm thankful I've never worked at an institution that does this, because it is bothersome, and I don't know how many are out there, but I know there are a few. And I guess the point would be never just look at the bottom line, right? Because in this bottom line, you just, oh, yeah, they're all the same. Until you look at the grant and scholarship line and you see like, wow, this one isn't providing any grant and scholarship. And these two institutions have put within this a parent loan. And that would be a federal parent loan, the federal plus loan, that a parent still would need to apply for if they wanted to take that loan. So in my eyes, I kind of find this as trickery, and institutions shouldn't do that. But again, just make sure you are looking at every single line that's on the financial aid package. Make sure you're asking any questions if you have questions. Typically what I do when I might sit down with a family, I sometimes, like people in my town, neighbors, all right, let's sit down, you have these different financial aid packages. Let's look at the direct costs, the tuition fees, room and board, and then take the grant and scholarship aid for each of those institutions. That way you can compare apples to apples, right? And get a sense of, okay, where are we with that? Then if you're deciding the student might take a loan, you could kind of subtract that off and see where you are. That, in my opinion, is the best way to be able to kind of compare financial aid packages. Every award letter looks different. I remember when before I was even at Simmons, I had sat with someone who worked in our mailroom at Harvard, and her daughter had gotten an acceptance from Simmons. She had this financial aid award, and she was comparing that with one other one. And I remember looking at this financial aid letter like, what is this? Because all they gave you was a cost of attendance without any sort of detail. And then, so it was a process of me saying like, okay, let's look at the website, find those figures, so that we can make a comparison. You can bet when I started at Simmons, which wasn't long after that, it was another 6 months or so, that one of the first things I did was change that particular financial aid letter, because it was, in my opinion, unhelpful. So that's just kind of a tip of what I do, obviously. One other thing I would say is MIFA does offer after the acceptance webinars. Those are really helpful because at that point in time when they offer those, you likely have the financial aid letters in hand. And you might say, gosh, what did Amy say back in October? Or I'd really like to talk to someone now that I have something tangible in front of me. So they do offer those. So if you sign up for MIFA emails, you can be alerted to those webinars. Any questions before I move on to the paying part? And then just a few more slides, and you guys will be done. I know this is a lot of information. Okay. So in this slide, it's kind of thinking about actually paying the bill. And really what I just like to talk about is that it doesn't have to come from just one source, right? Likely you're looking at a variety of sources. So some might be coming from past income. Student savings. Maybe the student has been working diligently saving so that they can put some of their earnings towards paying that bill. Perhaps some is coming from parent savings or a college savings account. Perhaps some is going to come from current wages. And really nice that most institutions have payment plans available, so rather than just having to pay an amount in the fall and paying an amount in the spring, you can break out those semester payments by the payment plan, and so it might be 4 or 5 monthly payments. And then perhaps some is coming from future income, and education loan. And really, you know, with these two, it can come down to figuring out, okay, what might I be able to assume as a monthly payment? And maybe it's a combination between, you know, a loan and payment plan. And then also, and I know that this isn't another slide, but just remembering that it's the 4-year, you know, venture. So much gets put into that first year, and kind of figuring that out, and just, you know, that reminder. And I also always say at these presentations, just my suggestion, obviously I can't dictate what you do with your family, but I personally just suggest that you have conversations about financial fit as early as possible, right? And kind of what is reasonable for that student and your family. Because when those conversations happen later and the student kind of becomes to get excited about a particular institution, or I've seen it where it's they've already deposited and we're into August and the bill still hasn't been paid and the billing due date is passed, and then all of a sudden finally this conversation happens and it isn't going to work out. It's so much easier to try to have them earlier. Again, just my suggestion. Every family is different in how they talk about finances, but from my experience, it usually is a little bit better if they happen earlier. Some kitchen table conversations, you know, that there are options for students. So if in going through the process, it feels like, you know what, we'd like to find a different way to go toward, and maybe starting at community college might save money. Also considering how many students need to go through college. I've already mentioned about, you know, that it's the 4 years, and remembering that rather than just trying to put everything into figuring out that first year. Things like, is the student considering graduate school? And, you know, you might also as a parent say, and I will help here, but graduate school, you're on your own. Knowing your credit score, if you do plan to borrow loans, I'm not going into detail about kind of private education loan or parent loans. The federal government does have a Parent Plus loan. It has a not insignificant origination fee. They're trying to get rid of it. We'll see if that passes in some laws that are being put forward. There's one by the Republicans, one by the Democrats. They do agree on that, trying to get rid of that origination fee, but a lot of the other stuff they don't agree on, so we'll see what actually comes forward. But if you have good credit and a good credit score, oftentimes you can get a lower interest rate and on a private education loan, so just not through the government, and usually without that origination fee. And then comparing, as I said, each school's net price when you are looking at all of the institutions and what has been offered. Some other options, in the state of Massachusetts, we have the mass transfer, which makes transferring from community college into one of our 4-year public institutions, like automatic transfer of credit. And with a certain GPA, there can be money associated with that as well. And then for programs that are not in the state system here in Massachusetts, there are opportunities to, at an out-of-state institution, public institution, receive the in-state tuition if that program does not exist in Massachusetts. So free resources, FAFSA Day. Massachusetts is Pre-pandemic, we always held in person. We had about 30 sites across the state of Massachusetts where we would be at a high school or a local college and utilizing the computer labs so that people could sit down and complete the FAFSA. Oftentimes, I honestly, because I have volunteered, I've also been tri-chair of that organization for a number of years, but just knowing that someone was there, right, if you needed to ask a question was helpful. Through the pandemic, we pivoted to online, like many places did. And in the first year, we did a lot of presentations and answered questions, and we created a lot of materials, which are on our site and like an FAQ. And then we went into utilizing Zoom and the breakout rooms so we could kind of recreate that one-on-one experience of being able to sit with a financial aid person and ask a question. And they're still doing that now. It's actually been challenging trying to get it back to be in person because it takes a lot of people and coordination and kind of site coordinators at each place. And then also in Massachusetts, Mass EdCo does a lot of work providing help to people, free financial aid help at the Educational Opportunity Centers. And then this slide, I always feel terrible putting this up because at this point you've been saturated with so much information. If you want to take a picture, I also can send this to Mr. Adubato and he a PDF and then could kind of put that, get that out to people if they want. I would say just look here, right? You can check off attend MIFA's Financial Aid 101 webinar, kind of focus here on stuff. I'm not going to run through every single bullet here, but if you want to take a picture of it, certainly feel free. And then what you can do now, I keep thinking this is the last slide. Do you want me to go back? Were you taking a picture? All right, go ahead. Yep, sorry. I'll take a breath. The next slide I know is what you can do now. I'll leave it up still if anyone's taking pictures. So what you can do now is get that FSA ID for student and parent if you have not already done so. Research the deadlines, the required applications, and looking at the website for each institution, the admission and financial aid websites. If you want to be, you can either sign up for MIFA emails, so throughout the process they'll send reminders about things and timely information. I've signed up for them myself because I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to start getting junk and what is it that they're providing, and it is good information. But you can also just go to their website, mifa.org, under events. You can register for things there. You can look at recorded sessions. So you can just do that if you don't want to sign up for the emails. You can connect with them on social media. And finally, and actually MIFA mans our FAFSA Day phone line. We cover the email, but you can always call them if you have general questions. You can call any institution as well. Any financial aid office should be able to answer general questions, but MIFA is another resource that can answer questions because all of those folks are knowledgeable. Many of them have worked in financial aid previous to working at MIFA. And that's the last slide. Are there any lingering questions? All right. Well, as I said, oh yeah. Yeah, so the question is, when you receive the financial aid package from an institution, how does it come? Does it come with the admission? Does it come separately? It depends. You should have expected that answer. It depends on the institution, how they might send it. Many will send the admission first, right? And then and depending on when their deadline is, you know, it might be a couple of weeks later, it might be a month later that then you receive the financial aid award. Some institutions might try to align the two, and you're getting both sets of information at the same time. But it really just depends on the institution. And it should, typically on their website, hopefully they have some bit of information, but feel free to just call and ask, you know, hey, I was just wondering when I would get, you know, that information.